Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much to the Foreign Policy Association, to Ambassador Polgar for that very lovely introduction. I thought they banned the word dialectic from the LA Times, so that's why I was surprised to hear that. I am a historian, sometimes a policy wonk, always a follower of Latin America, and especially having been educated in the field of area studies during the Cold War, when the U.S. government was putting money into funding language studies and area studies in undergraduate and graduate schools. This was a period of time when in the field of Latin America, we were training vastly, in my view, too many people to know too much about a tiny little country called Cuba, and not nearly enough people to know Portuguese and a large and important country such as Brazil. So I'm very much a product of our country's history, of the history of U.S.-Latin American relations, in the sense that, as the ambassador mentioned, just a little bit about my background, I have been to Cuba many, many times since I was 19 years old, and I won't give you the exact years, so you'll have to kind of figure it out, but it's a place that I have come to appreciate from many different angles. And by that I mean I have been in the Cuban prisons leading delegations of human rights experts into the prisons in the 1980s, done my doctoral research in Fidel Castro's archives documenting the period in the 1950s of the insurrection against Batista, and more recently at the Council on Foreign Relations with my policy hat on, worked on in various iterations, including those meetings in the palace with Fidel, with his cabinet. So I have gotten to know, I've been there with my family, with my young children, gotten to know the country from various different angles over more than 2 decades. And I'm not going to try to say what's in that book tonight. Hopefully you'll be inspired to buy it. It's written in a Q&A format, so it should be somewhat accessible. But tonight what I'd like to do, before I take your questions, is talk about some very recent history, the period between 2006 and 2009, from the time that Fidel Castro announced he would be stepping aside due to illness, to 2009. That year I choose because it's the year that ends one administration in the United States, begins another, and also coincides with the assumption of power, actually in 2008, of Fidel's brother, Raul Castro. And then I'll talk a little bit going forward, looking into where we are today, both in what's happening in Cuba, what's happening in the United States, and what we might be able to expect in the bilateral relationship. Just I would like to just make reference to, because I can't go into it, the importance of thinking about this very recent history against a backdrop in which you can think about Cubans as endlessly focused on history and Americans as endlessly focused on the future, and the imbalance of power between the two governments always being very much top of mind, especially from the perspective of Havana, where it isn't just starting in 1959 and the revolution that the power struggle, if you will, over who controls Cuba's destiny begins to unfold, and the antipathy between the two countries really erupts. But really this tension goes way, way back, and I would say, historically speaking, with my historian's hat on, Cubans living in Cuba or in the diaspora have always and always will attempted to use Washington to shape their battles with one another about Cuba's destiny. I say that just as a bit of background. And now what I'll do is, and of course, just last point, that history has left a Cuba now today in 2010 very nationalistic, very focused on preserving independence after dependence on various large foreign powers over its history, and very, very nationalistic. The fundamental legacy, one of them, that the revolution, the Castro-Cuban revolution, will leave to the Cuban people going forward, but not just to the Cuban people on the island, rather throughout the diaspora, is this commitment to independence from the United States. The recent period, and I should say that in wearing my policy hat at the Council on Foreign Relations, from about 2001 until 2006, I was busy thinking and working on other issues. But when Castro announced he would be stepping aside and put his brother and a half dozen of his closest comrades, both from back in the day in the mountains in the 1950s and more recently those that he had trained over the course, especially beginning in the 1980s, at that moment it became very, very important for me and for many others to begin again to follow events in Cuba with the expectation and hope and expectation that some change would begin to come, not only on the island, but potentially as we were in a political transition that was imminent in the United States in the bilateral relationship. So I'll talk about Havana, then I'll talk about Miami, very important. And by Miami, I mean the Cuban exile community in South Florida, but beyond. Then I'll get up to Washington, and then I'll bring us to the future, to today and to the future. The period between mid-2006 and the end of 2008, that's when Fidel was at his, especially in 2006, at his sickest, and it's also a period of time when Raul, looking out domestically and internationally, begins to undergo a course of sort of pulse-taking with the Cuban people, encouraging in various venues Cubans to air their dirty laundry, if you wish, to talk about everything that's gone wrong, what they want to change, what they'd like to see differently, and to begin to develop what he articulated when he took office, which I would describe as a very modest and moderately paced reform agenda. He took office in February of 2008 and articulated that agenda in notably and refreshingly only 34 minutes of his inaugural address. And he laid out a vision that wasn't didn't lay on the table an extreme radical change for Cuba, but talked about steps that the government would be taking to improve the material and spiritual lives of the Cuban people. He didn't talk about capitalism, he didn't use the word market, but he talked about productivity, he talked about inefficiency, he talked about the unfairness of the dual currency system, the unfairness of having many people live on the dole but not work, and some people work hard and not be paid enough. He drew the fabric back on sort of the open secrets of everything that was wrong with a very inefficient socialist bureaucratic system that nevertheless had continued to deliver on the basics, the other piece of the domestic legacy in Cuba, the economic and educational gains, deteriorated but nevertheless gains. So in 2008, the first half of 2008 is really a time of heightened expectations in Havana, raised not only by Fidel stepping aside and Raul taking power, but the specific measures that he put on the table: an agrarian reform, access to hotels, the right to buy cell phones and computers, potentially the elimination of the government controls on Cubans traveling abroad. A lot of sort of spaghetti was thrown up on the wall in those early days. But what happened? Second half of 2008, food and fuel crisis, global financial crisis, and Cuba is hit by two hurricanes, one after another, that take out 20% of the country's GDP. The global financial crisis, of course, precipitates the drop in tourist revenue, the drop in remittance revenue. Some of Cuba's commodity exports have also declined. I'm thinking of the value of bauxite by comparison to 2005, $400 a ton, to today, much less. Those numbers are guesses. I can't actually remember the specific numbers, so don't quote me. In any case, there was a steep change in the international economic outlook, but over a course of 12 months that I think created a set of very difficult conditions for this new Cuban government, same family, new government, and really is a new government with new people and new rules and new ways of doing things, from moving forward with this quite modest agenda of reforms laid out at first. But expectations were high among the Cuban people, and also largely not only because of the domestic picture, but because of the campaign in the United States, in which the Democratic candidates, especially candidate Obama, was talking about reaching out to adversaries as a fundamental tenet of his foreign policy, and then went to the heart and soul of the Cuban American exile community, the Cuban American National Foundation, and very anti-Castro historically, and still, and campaigned to lift the ban on travel for families to Cuba, for the sending of remittances to Cuba, talked about reaching out to Havana, talked about reinstituting some of the people-to-people initiatives that we had starting, especially with the papal visit in 1998 between the two countries. So expectations were heightened not only among the Cuban people and population, but also in the Cuban government, although they tried not to reveal those expectations. It was palpable toward the end of 2008, 2009, that this President Barack Obama, was somebody that Havana hoped to be able to negotiate a series of agreements with bilaterally, and also see political will toward, as the president himself said when he took office in the first few months, opening a new chapter toward Cuba and ending what he described as a failed policy. So let me touch on Miami a little bit, because Miami is a very important piece of the story. In Miami in this period, and really in the first 10 years of this century, we've seen a steady increase, we've seen a steady shift in Cuban American public opinion away from solid support for the embargo, for diplomatic isolation, and toward support for humanitarian, family, people-to-people, and now full-blown lifting of the travel ban. We saw during the election campaign that the president won 35% of the Cuban American vote by campaigning not on the hardline platform that Bill Clinton had campaigned on 10 or 12 or 14 years earlier, but on a, by comparison, pretty progressive platform. Won that 35%, won only the younger cohort of the Cuban American electorate, and therefore had, in my view, a great deal of running room, because those 27 electoral votes in the state of Florida were not delivered fundamentally by the Cuban American community, but by non-Cuban Hispanics, by independents, by Democrats newly registered, by a wide and varied quilt of voters. The Cuban American vote wasn't responsible for it. But probably the most important and recent turning point among the Cuban American community, and this is South Florida more than New Jersey, is the concert by the big Colombian pop musician named Juanes. I don't know if you followed this, but in September of 2009, Juanes and I became friends with him a little bit, because during this process, so I'm speaking from a little bit of personal enthusiasm. He went to Havana and he held a concert in the plaza with 1.2 million people, Cubans of every stripe. That's almost the entire city of Havana that went to the plaza. And he brought Cuban groups from Miami, from New Jersey, Latin American groups, and it was a hugely important moment for Cuba, for Cuban Americans, and especially for the relationship between the two. Prior to the trip, he was Dixie-chicked. His CDs were steamrolled over by anti-Castro Cubans who thought that he was betraying the cause, who opposed his holding this concert. After the and public opinion did not fully support him doing this. After the concert, widespread support, not only for the concert, but for the idea that it's possible to break down barriers between the two societies. And that, I think, really has placed now, incredibly, public opinion in the Cuban American community in South Florida and in the country ahead of where Washington, D.C. is currently. And that's probably the first time in the last 50 years that Miami has been ahead of Washington when it comes to Cuba policy. Truly astounding. Washington, let me say a little bit about the legacy of the the 2 terms of the Bush administration, the legacy that the Obama administration has inherited. Because I think it's important, lest you think or we come down too hard, which I think I will, on the Obama administration and its Cuba policy. But just to be fair, by the end of 2001, because of the people-to-people exchanges that had been put in place in the 1990s, a couple 100,000 Americans per year were going to Cuba, Cuban Americans as well, in exchanges on arts and culture and baseball and science and a whole range of professions, getting to know one another with the governments facilitating the process, not getting too much in the way, and using the process themselves to learn a whole lot about one another. That was stopped by the Bush administration. Most travel by Cuban Americans, other than every 3 years, was stopped. Most remittances, other than a few $100s a year, was stopped. And the twice annual contacts between our diplomats on immigration and other neighborhood security issues were also brought to a halt. The administration also appointed a transition coordinator, somebody in the State Department whose job was to coordinate Cuba's transition, just to reinforce Cuba's worst nightmares about the American impulse to control its domestic politics. And that transition process, that notion that Washington could manage Cuba's transition was aptly illustrated in the production of a huge volume by the Commission on the Transition to Cuba, it's not the exact title, that came out 2 weeks before Fidel Castro announced his illness and that he was stepping aside. And what it essentially said was, the mission of the United States government and our policy is to interrupt any succession that shall take place when Fidel leaves. And it is also, and it sort of broke it down by sector, to assist the new transition government in reinventing Cuba, remaking Cuba into a society, a political model, an economic model more consistent with the American vision for the Americas. That's put very, very benignly. But it was its detachment from Cuban reality was exposed dramatically when Fidel's illness, following his illness, a stable succession unfolded. The United States had no capacity to interrupt that succession. But probably most importantly from the perspective of American national interests and security interests at that time, because the administration had cut off all ties virtually with Cuba, had the changes there been chaotic, been disruptive, the United States, with a real interest in stability right there in our neighborhood, would have had literally no one to call. Our Rolodexes were out of date. Even though the same people were in power there, the relations had soured so much that really it was a rocky time made potentially rockier by our isolation from one another. Okay, so jumping ahead, the Bush administration left a legacy of isolation, lack of contact, and suspicion. And I should say that that wasn't only a result of bilateral policies toward Cuba, but also a result of our war in Iraq. The framing of the war in Iraq as explicitly about regime change, the fact that Cuba was and remains on the American terrorist list, the fact that Cuba followed our insurgency and counterinsurgency, in Iraq very, very closely, and its framework put the Cuban government on notice that perhaps it might be next. Now, you might poo-poo that and say, that's impossible, we'd never do that in Cuba. But the national security mentality in Cuba is such that they prepared for it nevertheless. And it made all the kind of civil society, democracy promotion sorts of programs that had been going on before George Bush, but really stepped up in their funding and their hostility of their intention under Bush. It made those programs highly suspect and put in danger dissidents, reformers, human rights activists on the island who dared associate themselves with those programs. 2010. Could you tell me how much time I have? Let me, in my 5 minutes, in my first minute, summarize for you, and you'll ask me all the questions that I failed to address. Summarize for you 2009 in terms of U.S. policy. Break it down into two halves. The first half, the administration comes in, and because guys like President Lula in Brazil and Zapatero in Spain are pushing on the administration to make a serious change in its Cuba policy, and because this is an administration that does have a serious respect for the views of others and had hit real chords of multilateralism during the campaign, it wasn't only the facts of the case alone, but also pressure from our partners and friends and offers to help that motivated the president and his his team to put together a package of initiatives that they announced at the April Summit of the Americas in Trinidad and Tobago. And that's where they came out and said Cuban-American families can now visit, send remittances, and American telecom companies can try to negotiate a deal. 3 months later, in June, at the OAS General Assembly, the United States, which has traditionally controlled that entity, effectively stepped aside and allowed a resolution to be passed that gives Cuba a pathway back to the OAS since its expulsion in 1962. I think that was historic, and it was done because Washington was put on notice by all of the other Latin Americans that this would be a critical barometer of how to understand what Obama is and is not about for Latin America. So that's where it stops. Once the coup in Honduras takes place, the appointments process puts a lock on any movement forward. We finally have an assistant secretary in now, but the political will in Washington to move forward in Cuba has, I think, declined rather dramatically. On a sidebar note, it would be nice if, with the catastrophic crisis in Haiti, the two countries who are already working in Haiti could get together and collaborate and cooperate. I'll just say that. The administration doesn't have all the cards to play in terms of eliminating the embargo, as you know. And knowing that itself has kicked the can to Congress, where there is legislation on the books but not yet passed to lift the ban on travel. There are a couple of things that I learned tonight that the two senators from New York have not yet endorsed that legislation to lift the ban on travel for all Americans to Cuba. There's a couple things the administration could do, may not do, given its other priorities in foreign policy and our 10% unemployment domestically. One could understand that the plate is full. But going forward, taking Cuba off of the terrorist list, the State Department's terrorist list, would I think be an important step, making our own fight against terrorism credible and serious. It would also signal to the Cubans a level of seriousness that isn't seen yet, and perhaps generate some real cooperation on counterterrorism. A neighborhood security, a movement on regional neighborhood security. Cuba is a place where there is no organized crime, where there is no drug trafficking, and the Cubans would like to keep it that way. The Caribbean Basin, as you know, is a place where, between Central America and Mexico, the Gulf, what's coming up from the north, Cuba's at the center of it. We ought to be working more closely with them. The Congress needs to move further, and I think fundamentally, and I'll close on this point, we're stuck for in addition to the fact that there are domestic politics at play in both countries that limit the momentum, there does seem to be an expectation in Washington. It's been articulated by various officials, but I'm starting to think they believe it, that in order to go further, Washington requires Cuba to enact gestures, and gestures mean steps that would imply making domestic political changes in the Cuban system. And that equation that we'll lift pieces of the embargo unilaterally in exchange for you committing domestic political suicide is simply a recipe for a permanent impasse. I don't see in the near future, or even in the midterm, Jimmy Carter going down to Cuba and monitoring a multi-party election, nor do I see the IMF sending a team to do a massive restructuring program there. We're talking about a half century and a regime that is well accustomed to living, surviving, and at times even thriving under the status quo. So to undo the status quo and get to a more, not even normal, but natural state of affairs, I really do think the United States needs to take a few more additional and unilateral steps, especially with the knowledge that Fidel is 83, Raul is 78. This isn't going to go on forever, and by that I mean there's an opportunity now with those guys still there to start talking so that the space internally can be created for a more open society in Cuba to emerge. The United States does have a role in that. It's not the final decider, but it does have a role. Thank you very much. I'll take your questions.